In 1979, one of America's most respected film critics reviewed a new horror film and was so disgusted by it that he refused to write the director's name anywhere in his review. Not once. He called the film an El Sleazo exploitation film, guaranteed to nauseate you all the same. Added that it bored him first and then moved on, like naming the man behind it might dignify what he made. That critic was Roger Ebert. The film was Canadian. The director he wouldn't name was David Cronenberg. And we're about to spend the rest of this list explaining exactly what kind of country produces a genre scene willing to keep making films like that anyway for decades on almost no money, while its own critics refuse to even say their names in print. What does a country stereotyped as the politest place on earth actually do with all of its rage? I'm Dr. Nika, and this is Dominion of Fear. 13 Canadian films ranked, ending on the one that basically wrote the rule book for what Canadian horror even means. I'll give you spoiler warnings, so let's begin. Number 13, Grave Encounters, 2011, written and directed by the Vicious brothers, Colin Millihan and Stuart Ortiz. Grave Encounters follows the crew of a fake ghost hunting reality show who lock themselves overnight in an abandoned psychiatric hospital outside Vancouver, looking for footage to save their canceled series. The hospital, of course, actually is haunted and everything stops behaving like it should. Made for about $120,000, it went on to gross more than $5 million, a return most studio pictures would kill for. Canada doesn't have a Hollywood studio system underwriting genre films. What it has instead, it's tax credits, public funding bodies, and filmmakers who got very good at making something scary look expensive on almost nothing. This is that whole approach squeezed into 90 minutes, one abandoned building, a handful of actors, and a premise that does most of the heavy lifting on its own. What happens when the crew faking the scares for a paycheck finally runs into something that isn't faked? Psychologically, the film leans on what's called environmental threat. The dread of the space keeps changing its own rules. Hallways that shouldn't loop do. A crew member wakes up to discover a hospital ID bracelet has been fitted on his wrist while he slept, with no memory of anyone touching him. Once a location stops being trustworthy, our brain can't build a map of it. And without a map, there is no safe direction to run to. One alternate ending released for home video takes the idea even further, showing the last surviving crew member inside the very hospital he's trying to expose, telling the camera he's cured now and should be allowed to leave. That's a nastier final image than most found footage horror bothers with, because it doesn't end the threat. It just relocates the victim permanently inside it, forever, with a smile. Threat scale, 5.5 out of 10. Efficient, then deep, and that's its own kind of craft. Quick note on how this scale works for anyone who hasn't been here. And since you'll see it 13 times before we're done, it isn't measuring how scary a film is in a jump scare way. It's about how deeply a film violates something psychologically important, like memory, identity, language, and the body's basic trust in itself. That's why a quiet film can outscore something louder, and why efficient scares like this one land lower, even when they work exactly as they're meant to. Number 12 Pin, 1988. This one barely made a ripple when it came out. It premiered at Cannes in 1988, then got quietly dumped straight to video in America after a disappointing test screening, which is The only reason why it spent decades sitting on a shelf next to Child's Play and Puppet Master. Honestly, feels unfair to Pin, since at least Pin has the decency to never actually move. Chucky's out here committing felonies, and Pin just sits there being a really, really bad parenting choice. Directed by Sandor Stern, who also wrote the original Amityville horror screenplay. Pin follows a boy named Leon, who grows up believing his father's anatomically correct medical dummy used to teach him about the human body in clinical, matter of fact terms, is actually alive. When his cold, controlling father dies, Leon takes Pin home with him and keeps talking to him. Underneath the jokes, it's the actual horror, though. The dummy doesn't do anything. It never moves or speaks on its own, or even does anything supernatural in any way that you'd expect. That absence is the whole point. The horror here is about how far a controlling household can push a child's mind before that mind builds its own emergency exit, and how it feels to watch a person mistake a coping mechanism for a relationship. This is the first film on this list that where that idea shows up, and you're going to see it again before we're done. Canadian horror keeps circling back to threats that weren't ever standing outside the door in the first place. What happens to a kid who's only allowed to feel safe around something that technically isn't real? The film's shot with a stillness that mirrors Leon's own repression. Long static takes, clinical lighting, almost no music cueing your reaction for you. It's a slow burn, and the payoff is that Leon's descent never needs a jump scare to work. Small piece of trivia. David Hewlett, who plays Leon here, would go on 8 years later to headline Cube, a reminder of just how tight the Canadian genre scene actually is. Tread scale, 6 out of 10. Number 11, Chained, 2012, directed by Jennifer Lynch, David Lynch's daughter, and shot over just 15 days in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. Chained follows a 9-year-old boy named Tim, who's kidnapped alongside his mother by a cab driving serial killer named Bob. Bob kills the mother, keeps Tim chained in his house for years, renames him Rabid, and slowly starts grooming him to become his replacement. Lynch has talked about deliberately steering away from torture territory with this one, choosing only to focus on the psychology of the captivity over graphic violence. This isn't really a film about pain. It's about how identity gets reshaped under total, prolonged dependency. How do you build a whole personality inside a cage built by the exact person who put you there? Vincent D'Onofrio plays Bob with an unsettling amount of restraint, never once tipping into cartoon villainy, which makes the whole thing land harder. You don't get to hate him cleanly. That's the trap the film sets for us, too. What Tim experiences resembles what psychologists sometimes describe as trauma bonding, when prolonged captivity and extreme dependency distorts a person's emotional attachment to the person controlling them. It's a contestant term, not a clean diagnostic category, but the pattern that it points at is real enough, and it's exactly what this film sits inside for 2 hours. Saskatchewan's flatlands stretch out for miles in every direction around Bob's house, which means even if Tim did run, there'd be nowhere close by to run to. Beautiful province, and it's a terrible place to try to escape a serial killer on foot. The geography connects to something bigger about English Canadian horror, where Quebec horror turns inward toward the body and the domestic. A lot of English Canadian horror leans hard on landscape itself as a threat. Vast, empty spaces that isolate people long before anything violent shows up on screen. Shane barely needs its villain to feel dangerous once you understand how far the nearest neighbor actually is. Dread scale, 6.5 out of 10. Captivity stories sometimes hit a nerve most horror don't touch because they take away the one thing most horror still leaves you, an outside to eventually escape to. Number 10, The Dirties, 2013. At what exact point does pretending to plan something become actually planning it? Directed by and starring Matt Johnson on a budget of $10,000, The Dirties follows two bullied high schoolers, Matt and Owen, making a school film project about getting revenge on the kids who bullied them daily. What starts as a joke, black comedy, movie references, mock violence for a class assignment slowly stops being a joke to one of them. This is the hard film to sit through for normal people. But I guess I can say if you're here, then you're a Dominion. This movie is barely violent for most of its runtime. It's found footage shot mockumentary style, and Johnson plays a version of himself so convincingly awkward and real that you forget you're watching fiction until the film reminds you hard that you shouldn't have. Early scenes show Matt and Owen film elaborate, funny, fake death scenes for their class project in empty hallways after school, quoting Tarantino and laughing between takes. The exact kind of thing bored teenage filmmakers actually do. The film never signals which of those ordinary afternoons is the one where something shifts. The Dirties won the Grand Jury Prize at the 2013 Sundance Film Festival, and Kevin Smith personally picked it up for distribution, calling it the most important movie you'll see all year. The reason it lands the way it does because it never gives you a villain to blame, just escalating isolation and small warning signs that only show as warning signs in hindsight. A joke that goes a beat too far. A teacher notices something wrong and doesn't do anything about it. None of it looks like a red flag in the moment because the footage shows itself as raw and unedited. Your own mind keeps treating it like a documentary, even once it stops being like one. The exact same discomfort real found footage tragedy shows online. The film ends with Matt walking through his school carrying out what he only pretended to plan, still narrating the camera like it's just another scene for the project. And the ambiguity, if he can tell the difference anymore, is the entire horror of it. Dread scale, 7 out of 10. When fiction gets this close to recognizable real world violence, the distance between movie horror and real fear gets very thin. Number 9, Infinity Pool, 2023. What happens to a person when they realize consequences are something they could buy their way out of? Written and directed by Brandon Cronenberg, the son of David Cronenberg, this movie is a Canada-Croatia-Hungary co-production. Infinity Pool follows a struggling novelist named James and his wife on vacation at a resort in the fictional country of Litouka. After a fatal car accident, James discovers the country's justice system allows wealthy tourists to pay for a cloned copy of themselves to be executed in their place, while the real person watches. He survives it, then discovers just how easily that one experience becomes a doorway into something much darker. There's a line worth drawing here because it's going to keep mattering across the rest of this list. Brandon Cronenberg didn't invent body horror out of nowhere. He inherited from his own father. And we're going to be spending a lot more time with that name before we're finished. Infinity Pool takes that inheritance and points it somewhere new, at that tourism, privilege, and the horror of a person discovering that violence, once it stops costing anything personal, starts feeling like the only thing that makes them feel real and alive. The film initially received an NC-17 rating from the NPA in the US. Distributor Neon appealed. The appeal failed, and the film was then re-edited to secure an R, which tells you plenty about how far Cronenberg pushed the hedonism on screen. What's actually disturbing here goes past the violence. It's the structure of how James gets pulled in, one small transgression at a time, each one making the next one easier until the version of himself that existed before the vacation started isn't there anymore. Mia Goth's character, Gabby, ends up functioning almost like a tour guide into that decay, someone who's clearly done this loop before and finds James's horror and his own actions more entertaining than alarming. There's a part late in the film where James is dressed up and paraded in front of a local family whose relative he's killed, and as a stand-in, forced to participate in a ritual he doesn't understand while a room full of strangers photograph him for entertainment, and his own confusion about whether he's the victim or the perpetrator in that room is the whole film distilled into one scene. The film never lets Gabby feel like a villain exactly. She's just further down a road James is only beginning to walk. Dread scale, 7.25 out of 10. Watching someone's moral floor disappear in real time, one consequence-free kill at a time, earns its spot in pure volume of escalation. Number 8, Crash, 1996. What do you do with a body that started rewriting its own definition of pleasure without asking your permission first? Also, deeply, sincerely, why did nobody in this film think to just try therapy? Adapted by David Cronenberg from J.G. Ballard's novel. Crash follows a film producer named James Ballard who, after surviving a serious car accident, falls into an underground subculture of people sexually aroused by car crashes, including staged reenactments of real celebrity death crashes. Crash won the Special Jury Prize at Cannes, cited for its originality, daring, and audacity. And it's really one of the most controversial films Cronenberg has ever made. Jury President Ford Coppola reportedly opposed giving it any award at all, then was overruled by the rest of the jury, who created the Special Jury Prize as a compromise instead of letting the film leave with nothing. Okay, Coppola, I love you. I love Godfather, one of my favorite non-horror films, top one. But what the? No, I can't say that. Can I? Censor. Like, that's just. Anyway, let's get back. It didn't end Cronenberg's career the way some in the industry predicted it might. But the discomfort was real, and it's still real, watching it now. What makes this disturbing goes past the sex or the violence individually. It's really the clinical calm the whole film maintains around both. Nobody in Crash is hysterical or to think that anything strange is happening. That flatness is the horror. Watching a group of people treat it an alien desire is remarkable because to them it stopped to be alien or foreign a long time ago. The car itself becomes an upsetting symbol once you sit with it. Cars supposed to represent freedom and control, going from somewhere to somewhere. The whole mythology of the open road. Cronenberg takes that symbol and turns it into a site of violation and pleasure fused together, which corrupts something most people never think to feel uneasy about at all. Characters treat scar tissue and surgical marks left over from crashes as erotic territory, which pushes the whole thing past simple shock value into philosophical unease about what the body is for. Once technology and desire start rewriting its rules together, a real world hook sits underneath the fiction too. The film touches territory associated with a rare studied paraphilia known as symphorophilia, arousal tied to disaster or catastrophe, which is exactly the kind of detail that separates Crash from pure shock cinema. It's building its horror on the edge of something real, then inventing an alien desire from nothing. Dread scale, 7.5 out of 10. Desire disconnected from any normal context is one of the oldest disturbances in this genre because it forces you to ask what your own body might rewire itself around, given the wrong accident at the wrong time. Number 7, Red Rooms, 2023. What kind of person shows up to a murder trial every single day? And what does it say? We all kind of understand the impulse a little. Directed by Pascal Plante, Red Rooms follows a model and professional poker player named Kellyanne, who becomes obsessed with the trial of a man accused of torturing and murdering 3 teenage girls and selling footage of the crimes on the dark web. I'll be straight with you. This is one of the most acclaimed films on this list, one of the smartest pieces of horror to come out of Canada in years, but it earns a mid-tier spot here than a top 3 finish because the Deliverance slow burn opening asks a lot of patience before it starts paying off. Restraint is the whole point of the film, and I respect that. But restraint and disturbance don't always arrive on the same timeline for every viewer, myself included. I got bored. Once it does land, though, it lands hard. The film is really about spectatorship, about how easily curiosity slides into compulsion, and about the modern habit of building an entire identity around proximity to horror instead of just witnessing it. Kelly Ann's own life outside of the courtroom, modeling work and a solitary apartment, hours spent alone playing high stakes online poker against strangers, paints a portrait of someone who's already comfortable operating behind a mask before the trial ever gives her a reason to. The director has said in interviews he deliberately withheld almost all violent imagery, choosing sound design and suggestion over anything explicit, betting that an audience's own imagination would fill in the worse than he could actually film. For most viewers, that bet pays off. For anyone hoping for a faster hook early on, it asks for real patience first. The courtroom scenes themselves do a lot of quiet work too, shot with almost documentary flatness, no dramatic score, pushing you to a reaction. That restraint puts the weight on you to decide how you feel about what's being described, then being told how to feel by the filmmaking, which is more uncomfortable position to be left holding. Dread scale, 7.75 out of 10. Voyeurism horror works by turning the audience into the subject of its own argument, which is uncomfortable no matter how patient you are getting there. I want to stop the countdown here for a second because something shifts from this point forward. The first 7 films already showed you the symptoms. Infinity Pool showed a moral floor disappearing. Crash showed desire rewiring itself around catastrophe. Red Rooms showed curiosity sliding into compulsion. Threats that don't come from outside a person, they come from something already loose inside them. The final 6 push that same obsession all the way through its root, and they all trace back to one filmmaking bloodline, a father and a son working 40 years apart, who built the most influential version of this particular strain of Canadian horror. Memory, body, language, family, all turning against themselves from the inside. By the time we hit number 1, you'll understand exactly why that bloodline earns the top spot, and why an American critic's refusal to even print a name in 1979 ended up mattering so much more than he ever could guess at that time. Number 6, Spider, 2002. What happens when your own memory becomes the least trustworthy narrator in the world? Canadian-British co-production directed by David Cronenberg, based on Patrick McGrath's novel. Spider follows a man named Dennis, nicknamed Spider, recently released from decades in a psychiatric institution, moving into a halfway house near his childhood home in London. As he wanders the old neighborhood, he starts reconstructing memories of his parents, memories that don't stay stable for very long. This was the first time Cronenberg shot outside of Canada, on location in England, and everyone involved, Ralph Fiennes, Miranda Richardson, Cronenberg himself, waived their usual salary, suggesting to get their underfunded production made. That everybody pitches in energy runs through a huge amount of Canadian film history because the industry has never had the luxury of Hollywood money propping projects up the way American genre films usually get to rely on. Fiennes plays Spider almost entirely through mumbling and physical tics, barely any dialogue for most of the runtime, and the film forces you to inhabit a fractured, unreliable perception of reality without ever cutting away to stable outside view to reassure you what's real. He wanders through the same handful of streets over and over, muttering fragments into notebook nobody else can read, and layering string and stuff across his cramped room in patterns that mean something only to him. That claustrophobia of the mind is the disturbance here. The production design leads into that instability too. So the halfway house and the childhood home feel almost like the same space seen through slightly different eyes. So past and present visually bleed into each other, the same way they do inside Spider's own head. Spider eventually reveals that his memories have merged his mother and the woman he believes murdered her into a single figure, played by the same actress the entire time, which means every scene watched so far has secretly been unreliable from its very first frame. Rewatching with that knowledge changes the entire film, and not a lot of movies have that double life. Dread scale, 8 out of 10. Unreliable narration has always been unsettling, but Spider takes it further and never gives the audience a stable version of events to fall back on once the illusion cracks. Number 5, Thanatomorphose, 2012. What does it feel like to watch your own body quietly stop being on your side? Every skincare influencer's actual nightmare, and mine too, if I'm honest. Directed by Eric Falardeau, this film follows a young woman named Laura who wakes up one morning with strange bruises that never heal. Over the following days, her body starts to rot while she's still alive to watch it happen. Falardeau, at the time he wrote this, was working on a master's thesis about bodily fluids and gore and graphic cinema. With these new YouTube laws, I have to censor all of these so I don't get banned. And he's talked openly about the script growing out of a joke conversation with an ex about someone rotting from the inside, colliding with the actual research he was buried in. He's also cited Kierkegaard's writing on despair as a direct influence on the film's psychological core, an unusual pedigree for a body horror movie made on almost nothing. The film gives you zero explanation for why Laura is decomposing, and there's no virus or curse, no answer at all, which is the whole point. Forget the how. This is existential horror stripped down to its rawest form. A body that keeps existing after it's already started dying. What makes it worse? How mundane the early stages work. A bruise that won't fade, and a smell from she thinks it's from another place from the apartment. Small enough details that only her and the audience keep explaining away until explaining away becomes impossible. Dread scale 8.5 out of 10. Disgust horror usually needs a villain to aim at. This one aims the disgust at your own physical existence instead. And that's a much harder thing to look away from. Number 4, Possessor, 2020. What happens when two separate consciousness tries to drive the exact same body at the exact same time? Written and directed by Brandon Cronenberg, Possessor follows Tasia Voss, a corporate assassin who uses brain implant technology to take over other people's bodies and carry out high-profile killings from inside them. On her latest job, her host, a man named Colin, starts fighting back for control of his own mind. Possessor is dripping with the kind of ultra-gory that runs in the Cronenberg bloodline. But where his father's films tend to explore the body rebelling against its own owner, Brandon's film is about the body becoming a battlefield two different owners are actively fighting over. That's a fresh angle inside a genre his own family basically built decades earlier. The horror operates on two levels at once here. There's the visceral body horror, faces melting, gore that never lets up. And underneath that, a much colder horror about identity itself, about how much of a person is actually just habit and how easily that habit can be hijacked by someone determined enough. Boss's own home life, a husband and son she barely seems to connect with anymore, suggests that her job has already been hollowing her out long before Colin starts fighting back. She rehearses her own facial expressions in a mirror before each job, practicing being human again after wearing someone else's body for weeks at a time, mouthing lines like "I love you" and "I'm fine" until they sound natural again. It implies the version of herself we're watching in her own home might already be a performance too. There's a colder idea sitting underneath all of it as well. The company running these assassinations treats Voss's mind as equipment to maintain, running diagnostic checks on her the same way you service a machine, not a person to be cared for. And the film never dresses that up as anything other than exactly what it is: labor that happens to occur inside someone else's skull instead of a factory floor. Dread scale 8.75 out of 10. Loss of bodily autonomy is one of the oldest fears horror has access to. And Possessor doesn't just threaten it, it makes you watch the actual struggle for control happen in real time. Number 3, Pontypool, 2008. What happens when the actual words you use to think become the thing trying to kill you? Directed by Bruce McDonald, based on Tony Burgess's novel, Pontypool changes everything. It follows radio shock jock Grant Massey as he broadcasts from a small town radio station basement while reports come in of a strange outbreak spreading through the area. The infected aren't zombies exactly. They're what the director calls conversationalists, people whose grip on language itself has started to fail in ways that eventually turn them violent. MacDonald described the violence in three stages. First, you repeat a single word, usually a term of endearment. Then your language scrambles completely. And finally, you become so distressed by your own broken speech that the only relief left is trying to chew your way out into somebody else's mouth. That's smart world building because it locates horror somewhere no one has bothered to look, inside the actual mechanics of communication. The entire film takes place in one radio station. Almost the whole outbreak happens off screen and gets relayed to you only through sound. You're stuck in experiencing the collapse of language only through language, which means the film's own dialogues start working against you as the runtime goes on. Characters slipping through mid-sentence, repeating a syllable, catching themselves, and then you catching yourself bracing every time someone in the room pauses a beat too long, I'd be dead. There's a real linguistic concept underneath this too, semantic satiation, the documented phenomenon where staring at or repeating a single word too many times makes it temporarily stop meaning anything at all, dissolving into pure sound. McDonald builds an entire outbreak logic out of exploiting exactly that glitch and how human brains process language. Pontypool was also made at the same time as a full radio play, broadcast by the BBC, which fits the whole premise almost too perfectly, don't you think? A story about a virus that spreads through spoken language, told a second time in a format made entirely out of spoken language. And both versions still work. The film's own writer, Tony Burgess, even shows up briefly on screen himself, playing a singer in a band called Lawrence and the Arabians. A small blink from a story so committed to the danger of words that its own author had to prove he could still say a few words safely. Dread scale, 9 out of 10. Body horror threatens your physical self. This threatens the actual tool your mind uses to organize reality. And once that tool fails, nothing else can be trusted either. Number 2, Videodrome, 1983. What happens once the line between watching violence and becoming part of it stops becoming a line at all? Written and directed by David Cronenberg. Yes, another Cronenberg. Videodrome follows Max Wren, president of Pacific TV, a sleazy Toronto cable station always hunting for edgier programming, who stumbles onto a pirate broadcast called Videodrome, showing what looks like real torture and murder with no plot at all. Max wants to air it. The deeper he digs into where the signal is actually coming from, the more his own body and mind start to physically warp. Cronenberg has said the idea came from his own childhood, picking up American TV signals from Buffalo late at night after Canadian stations went off air, and worrying he might stumble on something not meant for him to see. That personal seed grew into one of the best films about media, decades before anyone was talking about algorithmic content or doom scrolling. Videodrome basically predicted the exact anxiety a huge amount of people live inside now. A screen that no longer just shows your reality. It actively rewrites what your own body and mind believe reality is. Civic TV itself was modeled on City TV, a real Toronto station, notorious in the 70s for airing softcore late-night programming, known locally as Baby Blue Movies. And Max's colleague, Moses, is a nod to City TV's actual real-world co-founder, Moses Namer. Cronenberg wasn't being subtle about the reference. He wanted Toronto audiences in particular to recognize exactly what he was pointing at. The makeup effects, the stomach that opens up to physically swallowed videotapes, a gun that fuses directly into flesh, were led by Rick Baker's team, with Baker himself fresh off winning the first Academy Award for Best Makeup ever given for An American Werewolf in London the year before. He wasn't some unknown hired cheap. He was already the best in the world at what he did, and the work still holds up at some of the most unsettling practical effects of the entire decade. One phrase keeps happening around the film: the new flesh, meant to describe a coming fusion between human bodies and the technology feeding them images. And it's aged into something closer to prophecy than metaphor. That's not my opinion. I mean, that I'm not gonna say that's 100%. I'm just saying, you know, I can't say anything 100%. Cronenberg wasn't talking about phones or algorithms, because neither existed yet, but the underlying anxiety that the boundary between a person and the media they consume might not hold forever, reads almost uncomfortably current now. The film closes with Max watching himself pull the trigger on a television screen, then doing it in reality moments later, muttering, "Long live the new flesh." And Cronenberg never tells you if that what that means. If is it death? Is it evolution? That is, and it's deliberate. It stays unresolved for 40 years, argued over in film school essays and horror forums and it's all serious talk. The film doesn't hand you a correct answer to grab onto. Watch this one next to Possessor, and you'll notice Brandon Cronenberg picking up this exact question years later, whether a mind that's been rewritten by an outside force is still the same person underneath, just answering it through implanting technology instead of pirate broadcast signals. Dread scale, 9.5 out of 10. The Brood, 1979. What happens when therapy designed to release your trauma instead gives that trauma a body of its own and lets it out into the world? Written and directed by David Cronenberg, of course, The Brood follows Frank Carwitt, whose estranged wife, Nola, is undergoing an experimental psychotherapy at a secluded institute that encourages patients to put their trauma into a physical form. Nola's rage doesn't stay internal. It starts producing small mutant children born from her own body who go out and violently attack people that she's angry at. And this is the film Ebert refused to name Cronenberg for. 47 years later, it's much easier to see what he was actually looking at. It's also film Cronenberg that has openly called his most personal work, written and directly out of a brutal custody battle he was going through at that time. That raw, specific anger runs through every frame of it, and we can see it. This isn't abstract body horror for shock value. It's the father's terror about what unprocessed rage can do to a family and externalize as literally as filmmaking allows. Samantha Eggar, who plays Nola, has spoken about how physically and emotionally grueling the role was, given how much of the film requires her to sit in raw, unfiltered maternal rage without any softening. Ebert's review is, I have to quote it exactly. The Brood is an El Saliezo exploitation film camouflaged by the presence of several well-known stars that guarantee to nauseate you all the same. That's after it bores you first. And then, as you know, he never mentioned his name. A hostility so complete it accidentally became one of the most quoted horror reviews in Canadian film history. It didn't kill the film's reputation, and that's good. It just delayed it. People who matter, especially John Carpenter and Martin Scorsese, were quietly championing Cronenberg's work as serious art long before American critics caught up. Canadian horror obviously existed before 1979, but The Brood is the film where the pattern running through this whole countdown, threats that come through inside then outside, finally locked into place as a defining national style. It came directly out of the attack shelter from years that stretch in the 70s and 80s, where Canada let investors write off 100% of what they put into Canadian films, which accidentally funded a genre boom that nobody in government actually planned for. Cronenberg's early Cinepics backed films, Shivers, and then Rabid, and then this, took brutal heat from Canadian critics and cultural gatekeepers of that time, who saw this kind of movie as an embarrassment to national cinema. And Cronenberg has said he was even evicted from his own apartment for a stretch over the bad publicity Shivers brought down on him. The Brood is now considered one of the most important horror films the country has ever made, and I agree. And in my view, the pattern that locked into place is one later generations of Canadian filmmakers kept returning to, whether they were consciously nodding to Cronenberg or not. The design of the brood children themselves is worth pausing on. They're creepy, small, faceless, in a way that keeps them from ever reading as sympathetic or even fully human looking. I saw this when I was a kid and it was creepy. Cronenberg wanted them to feel like rage, give him the smallest possible body. Nothing softer, just anger with legs. The film builds to Frank finally understanding exactly how Nola's rage takes shape in real time, watching a new brood child merge from her body in front of him, and the choice he's forced to make about his own wife in that moment is the bleakest image in Cronenberg's entire films. It doesn't give you relief once it's over either. The film's final shot, it's the pattern isn't finished, and whatever passed through Nola has already started passing through their daughter too. Whatever is terrorizing this family isn't some outside force standing in from them symbolically. The family itself is the threat, and Cronenberg built it directly out of his own life to prove it, and you get it. Dread scale, 10 out of 10, the highest on this list. I'm gonna now talk about memorable mentions. They're essential. They're not built about the kind of psychological violation that main list is ranking on. There's no dread scale here. I'm just gonna talk about them. They're from craft, history, and pure entertainment instead. Why does a werewolf movie feel more honest about being a teenage girl than most straight coming out of the age dramas? Ginger Snaps from 2000 uses the lycanthropy as a puberty metaphor and remains one of the sharpest feminist horror films Canada has made. Sisters Ginger and Bridget deal with Ginger's first period, landing the same night she's been bitten by a werewolf, and the film treats both transformations, the biological one and the supernatural one, as versions of the exact same terror, right down to Ginger's own mother, assuming the early symptoms are just a rough go from adolescence, still influencing werewolf movies, and still one of the few horror films willing to say the quiet part out loud about how puberty itself gets treated as a body horror event. Cube from 1997, turning a total budget of about $350,000 into an entire cult sci-fi horror classic. A group of strangers wake up trapped inside a shifting maze of deadly booby-trapped cubes, with no memory of how they got there, forced to cooperate with people they haven't even met, while the room itself finds new ways to kill them. It's two parts and a Japanese remake of one clever premise, with Pin's own David Hewlett headlining as mathematician Worth. Proof again that the Canadian genre scene is a small enough group of their own, and their same faces keep turning up in it. My Bloody Valentine from 1981 sets a slasher inside a mining town during the Valentine's Day dance that gets canceled after a previous massacre. Then, of course, gets uncancelled by teenagers who never learn. It was so violent the NPAA cut 9 minutes out of it before it could release in the States. Footage that stayed lost for almost 30 years before a full uncut version finally reached fans on DVD. Terror Train and Prom Night from 1980, and both starring a young Jamie Lee Curtis, riding her Halloween momentum straight into Canadian slasher territory. Rarely get talked about outside of horror circles, but shape their genre's early rules right alongside their American counterparts. And Curtains from 1983 rounds out a trio of early 80s Canadian slasher worth seeking out if you like your kills with a side of masquerade mask. A quicker set worth knowing, Scanners and Rabid, two more early Cronenberg entries from that same tax shelter era. Rabid starring adult film actress Marilyn Chambers as a woman who develops a taste for blood after experimental plastic surgery. Scanners, released 2 years after The Brood, is the one people actually remember, mostly for its practical effect, a man's head exploding at a press conference. Built by lying specialist supervisor Gary Zeller beneath the gelatin and the plaster head, Cronenberg has said the whole production was rushed into shooting without a finished script, just to lock in that year's tax shelter subsidy before the deadline passed. It became his first movie to top the US box office, and a satisfying detail once you know how badly critics tried to bury him just 2 years earlier over The Brood. Antiviral, another Brandon Cronenberg movie, imagines a clinic that sells clients the actual diseases caught by their favorite celebrities. Splice follows two genetic engineers who splice human and animal DNA together and then make the baffling decision to raise the result themselves. Bad idea. Great movie. Turbo Kid brings gonzo, gloriously gory post-apocalyptic energy out of Quebec. And American Mary, which I've already covered in full. American Mary is one of my favorites, for sure. And it belongs on any serious lists on Canadian body horror. So what does all of this actually say about Canada? I talked about it earlier. A critic so disgusted he wouldn't even write a name down. A country that shows itself as endlessly polite, and underneath it, a genre tradition that kept insisting and showing exactly what happens once that containment finally fails. Penn introduced that idea. The Brood proved it. Cronenberg didn't invent Canadian horror. Plenty of it existed before him, and half the fast mentions of this list isn't even working in his register. What he did was crystallize one of its most powerful languages, one that his own son is still speaking decades later. And he's not copying him. And new Canadian directors keep inventing more with less money and just as much conviction. Because constraint teaches people to be inventive, and this country has decades of practice at exactly that. Tell me which one of these you're adding to your watch list. And if you've already seen one of these, I want to know if it hit you the way it hit me. Fear is the only honest thing. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.